Welcome to the Financial Flow. Please like and subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay up on our latest videos. In a short period of time, Apple was the first company on the US stock market to surpass $1 trillion, $2 trillion, and $3 trillion in value. There is no denying their success. It is therefore difficult to imagine that they were having difficulties in the 6 years prior to 1997 in the 1990s. Their market cap fell to about $3 billion as a result of their stock price falling from $70 to $14 per share. While this may sound like a large sum, it is actually only about 1% of what it is today. Later, Steve Jobs acknowledged that Apple was in very serious trouble and was only 90 days away from filing for bankruptcy. We discuss Apple's remarkable rise, fall, and resurgence in this video. Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs famously founded the business in the 1970s. Early on in that decade, the two had already collaborated on a shady venture where they would manufacture and market these blue boxes that could somehow hack the phone system and enable free long-distance calls. Even though they only made a few $1,000s from selling a small number of them, they learned a lot from the experience. A few years later, they got back together to launch a brand new company to market and sell their newly developed Apple I computer. It wasn't exactly a computer as you might have imagined. Rather, it was more like a kit that you would have to customize by adding your own components to after receiving the circuit board. Wozniak initially considered it to be a hobby, but Jobs persuaded him to turn it into a business, where they would manufacture and market them out of his garage. Steve Jobs sold his Volkswagen van to raise money for it, and Wozniak sold his pricey HP calculator. Together, they were able to raise about $1,300 to start the project. They determined the selling price to be 666.66%, and they ultimately sold 200 of them in San Francisco Bay Area. Because you had to be extremely computer savvy to use the Apple I computer, it was not very user-friendly, and you had no idea what you were looking at. They therefore set out to create something with a much wider appeal for their next product. The Apple II was a product created with the average consumer in mind, one of the most significant computers ever produced. It was like Apple's big break. The Apple II didn't need to be assembled, unlike the other products you would typically see on the market at the time. The fact that it is frequently credited with launching the entire personal computer market shows how easily they were able to sell it. It's estimated that they sold well over 5 million units by the time their run ended in 1993. This time they hired Mike Markkula, a retired marketing manager from Intel, who later became the CEO and chairman of Apple after purchasing a third of the business for $250,000. And later, for additional funding, they raised more than $100 million through an IPO of stocks in 1980, followed by another sizable offering the following year. The Apple III was plagued by thousands of defective units and recalls at the beginning of the 1980s. The Macintosh, however, was the decade's most notable innovation. It was distinctive because it had a mouse and a graphical user interface. Within the first 100 days, Apple sold 70,000 of them within 4 years. They had sold over 1 million. Their CEO at the time was John Sculley, who was recruited by Steve Jobs to work for Apple. By 1985, they were at odds with one another in a struggle for dominance, which ultimately caused Steve Jobs to leave Apple. In 1993, when Apple was already experiencing problems and looking for a new direction, John Sculley also left the company. And from there, things really began to spiral out of control, forcing them to change their leadership every few years. But none of them seemed to know how to fix the problems because they kept getting worse. Apple's market share for personal computers in the US was steadily declining, from around 16% at the beginning of the decade to single digits in the middle, and finally down to 4% by 1997. Then a number of other products they introduced that weren't for the computer market had their own problems that further harmed their reputation and hurt their financial situation. In many ways, 1997 stands out as their worst year. Sales were plummeting, and perhaps most worrisome of all, they lost more than $1 billion in that year. Nobody, at least in my opinion, was foreseeing that organization becoming the most valuable one in the nation in less than 2 decades. Steve Jobs was a major factor in their comeback. You cannot argue against the fact that if not, Apple might not even be where they are today. He took over as CEO shortly after, and held the position up until a few weeks before his passing in 2011. He also established some values and principles that served as a base for them to build on, and are still in use in many ways today. Making friends with Microsoft was one of the first significant things he accomplished. Although Apple and Microsoft have been rivals for a while, Microsoft stepped in with a much appreciated $150 million investment when Apple was at its lowest point. Steve Jobs had essentially admitted that they would lose to Microsoft because they were performing so much better than them. He acknowledged that he didn't have to defeat Microsoft at that point though. The fact that the one performs better than the other does not necessarily imply that they will both succeed. They might both perform better. With the release of Internet Explorer for the Mac, Apple and Microsoft reached an agreement to end their legal dispute. When Steve Jobs became CEO, they invested $100 million to acquire Power Computing, the largest manufacturer of these licensed computers. The new theory held that by simplifying the product mix, consumers would find it simpler to select the one that best suited their needs, and it would enable the business to concentrate more effectively on each of those products. There would be less division between their time and their money. He created the famous simplified grid with the names of retailers who sold desktop and portable computers to businesses and consumers in 1998. In the end, that consumer line would include the iMac, which was released in 1998, and the iBook, which was released the following year. Two of the first computers that perfectly represent Apple's new management style. Their marketing is the second factor in their comeback. The iMac was created with the intention of allowing customers to get on the Apple, faster and simpler than other computers on the market. Internet. They named it the iMac to emphasize the fact that it was online, because they believed that was what the average person cared about the most. It was the first time they had ever branded a product with the "I like that" phrase, and it has since proven to be a useful way to give all of their products a recognizable name. The iMac's aesthetic represents Apple's new strategy in another way. It stands out from other computers due to its distinctive shape and colors, and I believe that at that time, people thought it was attractive. Moving beyond computers is the final justification for Apple's comeback. We are all aware that the majority of their current success has nothing to do with computers, and instead has to do with the products like the iPod, released in 2001, the iPhone, released in 2007, the iPad, released in 2010, or the Apple Watch, released in 2014. They are all cutting edge, innovative products that have helped the business reach unbelievable heights. In order to reflect this shift toward consumer electronics, Apple Computers changed its name to simply Apple in 2007. Despite this name change, the company continued to operate under the same guiding principles. Apple has had a lot of issues in the past, but they are now in the clear. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Have a good one.